Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the prophetic literature. And today we're actually going to take a break from what can even in a broad definition be considered prophetic literature to consider something that's parallel to the books of Samuel and Kings, the books of Chronicles. If I'm being honest, I can't think of any better place to talk about the Chronicles than right here in Houston. For just as the Chronicler has a different point of view on Israel's history than the books of Samuel and Kings do, so we all know the Houston Astros have just a different point of view on the rules of baseball than any other team does. The Chronicles have been much neglected in Christian history. The book rarely shows up in the lectionary, and when it does, it's only in a small snippet. So I want to begin with this surprising claim in one of the commentaries on Chronicles. The first sentence of the commentary says, "The books of Chronicles are the Bible's best kept secret." I think it's an audacious claim because Christians really haven't paid much attention to the Chronicler. They've paid much more attention to Samuel and Kings. But let's look a little bit about how Chronicles has been considered differently in our tradition. In our agenda for today, we're going to look at three things. First, we're going to look at what are the Chronicles, what makes Chronicles unique and how it's been treated in the Hebrew and Christian traditions. Then we're going to look at how it's different from the books of Samuel and especially Kings. And then we're going to look at its own unique theology. Chronicles has a distinct theological viewpoint. First and foremost, what are the Chronicles? We have, as we know, two basic traditions. We have the Hebrew Bible, the MT, that is the Masoretic text, in which the text has been handed on in Hebrew. And then we have the Septuagint, which is in Greek, or the Vulgate, which is in Latin. And these books have two different names in the two traditions. In Hebrew, the books are known as Divrei Hayamim. Literally, that means words of the days. That is, these are words, these books contain words that describe the events of days long past. Whereas in the Septuagint and Vulgate traditions, these books are known as those of paralepomenon. Paralepomenon is a Greek participle that means stuff left out along the side. Notice the difference here. In the Greek and Latin traditions, Chronicles has a supplemental character. It's been characterized as something of an appendix to the historical books, and it occurs in the canon immediately after the book of Kings. Indeed, in the Septuagint tradition, Samuel and Kings are known as 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th kingdoms. And so this has the character of an afterthought. It's a weak position canonically. It's not in a place where it encourages people to actually read it. In contrast, in the Hebrew Bible, Chronicles is the grand conclusion. I mentioned already that Chronicles is not even by a broad definition considered a prophetic book. Instead, it's considered one of the writings, indeed the last of the Ketuvim, the writings, that last of the three sections in the Hebrew canon. Traditionally, Chronicles is associated with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew tradition, and they describe a post-exilic view of how Israel should try to restore its ideals. After the tragedy of the exile, what lessons can be gleaned? So let's go ahead and delve into our outline. You'll notice here Alan divides Chronicles, both books, into four main blocks. Chronicles is notable because it begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, which can be kind of a turnoff for a lot of people when they first access the book, but it provides a different sense of where Israel came from. That lasts 9 chapters, and then the reigns of David and Solomon take up 29 chapters. What I want you to notice here is how the Chronicler devotes 29 chapters of narration time to the reigns of David and Solomon. 2 Samuel spends a lot of narration time on David as well, but what I want you to see is that 1 Chronicles differs strongly from 2 Samuel. They don't tell the same stories about David. There's nothing about Bathsheba in there. There's nothing really about Absalom in there. Instead, there's a lot about how David makes preparations for the temple that will be built under Solomon. Then in 2 Chronicles, the divided kingdom is also presented differently. Not much is mentioned about the northern kingdom, and when it is, it's about how King Hezekiah includes them in his program of restoration. The Chronicler makes Hezekiah into much more of a hero, and makes his father Ahaz, with whom the prophet Isaiah had sparred, into much more of a villain. And then 2 Chronicles concludes by presenting Manasseh in very different terms, along with the denouement, which leads to the Babylonian exile. But even 2 Chronicles ends with a much more hopeful conclusion. Here are the 6 major differences I want you to know about. David and Solomon are unquestionably good characters in Chronicles. As I mentioned a moment ago, Bathsheba, the affair isn't even mentioned. Bathsheba is mentioned only in the genealogy of 1 Chronicles. Elijah and Elisha, as far as the Chronicler is concerned, do not exist. They are not mentioned, they are not discussed. Also, the Levites are far more prominent in the text. Notice especially their role in 2 Chronicles 29 during Hezekiah's reform in the late 8th century. Also very important, King Manasseh repents and he humbles himself. He is not the villain, much less the scapegoat that Kings makes him out to be for the exile. Let's also notice a significant difference regarding theodicy. In 2 Samuel 24, King David is incited to take up his ill-fated census because God is angry with Israel. If you look at 2 Samuel 24 verse 1, it blames God for the census. Whereas here in 1 Chronicles, we have a different culprit. It says, a Satan rose up against Israel. Incidentally, that word Satan, Satan in Hebrew, it's a cognate, means adversary or accuser. And he incited David to take a census of Israel. Let's now look at the major theological differences. I want to return to that matter of Manasseh. Again, he was the great villain in 2 Kings chapter 21. Let's contrast that with what we see here in 2 Chronicles 33. He does a lot of bad things. We hear about that at the beginning of 2 Chronicles 33, but then he's imprisoned by the Assyrians. And here's what happens. He humbled himself before the God of his ancestors and prayed to him. He heard his prayer and restored him to his kingdom in Jerusalem. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord is indeed God. Two things to point out here. In red highlighted, you see that expression, humbled himself. This is a key catchphrase of Chronicles. Indeed, more than half of all the uses of this Hebrew verb in the entire Masoretic text occur in the two books of Chronicles. And secondly, Manasseh knew that the Lord is indeed God. This is reminiscent of Ezekiel, another prophetic book that has a strong priestly sound to it. Another thing to point out here, the Chronicler casts a bit of a dour history. This is the beginning. This is the end of the genealogies of 1 Chronicles. We're in 1 Chronicles 9, 1b and 2. Now, Judah had been exiled to Babylon because of its treachery. The first to settle again in their cities and dwell there were certain Israelites, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. Notice three things here. One is the emphasis on the priests and Levites and temple servants, but also notice the rationale for the exile. It's not Manasseh's fault here. It's Judah's treachery. Treachery, another word that's used disproportionately often in the Chronicler. It's not quite as exaggerated as humbled himself, but it's the same general principle. This is key to Chronicles theology, this idea of treachery, betrayal of the Lord. And then let's see how the Chronicler concludes. This is how he narrates the exile at the end of 2 Chronicles. All this being the exile, was to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. Until the land has retrieved its lost Sabbaths, during all the time it lies waste, it shall have rest while 70 years are fulfilled. There's no scapegoat. There must be punishment in the form of exile, but there is hope. And this is a repeating motif in Chronicles. After the northern kingdom is taken into exile, this is what Hezekiah says. All Israel from Beersheba to Dan should come to celebrate the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Jerusalem. This is quite interesting because according to Kings, the northern kingdom is wiped out, never to be seen nor heard from again. That was 2 Kings 17. Here in 2 Chronicles 30, there's hope. Again, from Beersheba to Dan, that covers the land of all 12 tribes. Yes, a generation that sinned had to be punished, but there's room for redemption. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given to me, the me being Cyrus, all the kingdoms of the earth. He has also charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. All among you, therefore, who belong to his people, may their God be with them. Let them go up. What a happy ending. There's an opportunity for redemption. You can see why the Hebrew tradition would place this at the end of the canon. It speaks of an enduring faith and an enduring hope in what God is doing. We'll explore the post-exilic period a little later when we look at Ezra and Nehemiah in our next class. Until then, read well and pray well.